Amen. Please be seated. In the spring of 2002, my son Sam, who was 13 then, and I hiked the Inca Trail to Machu Picchu in Peru. We went with my friend Bob and his family, who live in New York City. It's a 4-day hike. You backpack and you camp along the way. It's pretty strenuous. It is the Andes. You have to go in a group. There were 4 or 5 others in ours, so we were about 10 of us all total. And you have to be accompanied by a licensed guide. Our guide was a young Peruvian man named Edwin, who was a great guide and a great guy, and had led groups on this hike many times. And on the second day of the hike, we learned that that day was Edwin's birthday. So we had a little celebration at dinner that night, and Bob, my friend Bob, decided to give Edwin a birthday present. All he had was in his backpack, so he gave him something out of his backpack. He had in his backpack, and he gave him a blue baseball cap with the letters NYPD on it, which, as you may know, stands for New York Police Department. Now, as I said, this was in the spring of 2002. That means it was 6 months after the attacks in New York on 9/11, and those blue baseball caps with NYPD on them and with NYFD on them for the fire department became a popular way for people to memorialize that event, to show that they carried it with them, to honor the people who had labored and had died on that day. That's why Bob had the hat. Well, Edwin knew that Bob was from New York, and he must have known what that hat represented. You could tell, because when Bob gave it to him, he accepted it soberly. He never cracked a smile. And though he had not worn a hat the first 2 days of the hike, he wore that hat for the final 2 days. And he kept it on for the train ride back to Cuzco, where we had started. And right through his farewell to us, he had that hat on. This was Edwin's way of honoring Bob's gift. Honoring both the fact that Bob had made him a gift in the first place at all, and honoring what that gift meant. He honored it by using it. That was, in fact, his gift back to Bob. And it ended up, in its way, being a gift to all of the rest of us who were around. That's the way to do it. If you truly appreciate a gift that is given not just as a formality, but one that has real meaning to it. If you truly understand the gift, then you honor it, and you honor the one who gave it by using it. We should be thinking about this particularly today, because today is the feast of Pentecost. It's a big day in the Christian church. It's one of the 7 principal feasts in our Episcopal calendar, and it is big because we celebrate today the gift of the Holy Spirit, a gift made to each one of us by God through the person of Jesus Christ. This is attested to in all 4 Gospels. The earthly Jesus tells the disciples, I'm going to send you the Holy Spirit. And in chapter 1 of the book of Acts, the resurrected Jesus tells the disciples, you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit not many days from now. That's a big gift, an infinitely big gift. And we hear it in a big, dramatic way in the story from Acts that we heard today, with the sound of a violent wind and the appearance of tongues of fire, and people suddenly able to speak in languages that are foreign to them. That story illustrates the scope of the gift of God given us in the Holy Spirit, a gift that changes lives, a gift that can communicate itself, can receive itself through us in ways that we cannot conceive, we cannot foresee, ways we never thought were possible. It's a beautiful, dazzling story, that story of the first Pentecost. But we must not allow its splendor, its mythic quality, to blind us to the fact that it has practical meaning for us. Today we behold this big gift, but we also behold that this big gift lives through us in many different kinds of gifts. Gifts that appear to us to be smaller, but all of them are animated in us by that big one, by the Holy Spirit. They partake of its essence like leaves on a tree. This is what Paul is talking about in today's passage from 1 Corinthians, and I hope that some of that penetrated through the welter of voices that you were hearing in other languages. Paul sees that the Holy Spirit is active in the church by working through the particular gifts of believers. The Greek word translated as gifts is charismata, from the root word charis, which means favor or blessing. We know it in our term charisma, charismatic. When we say that someone has charisma, we mean that there's something in that person's spirit that somehow enlivens our own. It touches us. So the gifts that Paul talks about are active instances of God's grace at work in the church, that is, among people of faith, not just in the building. This is the essence of those gifts. That's their meaning. And just as in the case of Edwin's hat, if the spiritual gifts God gives to us are to live fully in us, or to have the life that God intends, we have to honor them. So how do we do that? Well, Paul talks about a number of different spiritual gifts in this passage, some of which are easy to recognize as such. He talks about wisdom and knowledge. Although Paul talks about them in a particular way, he says the utterance of wisdom, the utterance of knowledge. There's something important about that language which can be easy to miss, and I'll get back to it. I'm sure we all go along with wisdom and knowledge as gifts of the Spirit, but some of the other gifts that Paul mentions, speaking in tongues, prophecy, working miracles, sound archaic to us, mythological, not happening today. Such an understanding is deceptive. It can lead us to insulate ourselves from awareness of the presence of the Spirit in our lives here and now. That understanding is also mistaken. Speaking in tongues is just one example of the power of the Spirit to overflow in us, beyond our capacity to describe it intelligently. Has that ever happened to anybody here? I'm sure that it has. Does it not happen today? Prophecy, in the biblical sense, is not foretelling the future. It's speaking the truth, proclaiming the will of God to an audience that is blind to it and is therefore either indifferent or hostile. Can that not happen today? Of course it can. One kind of miracle is bringing something out of nothing. Can that not happen today? We've all seen that happen. I've seen it in miracles from school teachers, from doctors and nurses. I've seen them on stage. I see them from my kids. We should understand also that Paul does not intend spiritual gifts to be limited to the ones that he talks about here in 1 Corinthians. In Romans 12, he talks about a whole different batch: ministry, teaching, exhortation, generosity, leadership, and compassion. Whatever creates communion, whatever opens the way for the love of God, that's a spiritual gift. And we all have gifts of the Spirit. Each one of them. In today's passage, Paul writes, God activates them in everyone. And here I will come back to how Paul speaks about spiritual gifts. As I pointed out, he talks about the utterance of wisdom, the utterance of knowledge. You see what's distinctive about that way of putting it? It's not the possession of wisdom that's a gift. It's the utterance of it. It's not the possession of knowledge that's a gift. It's the utterance of it. The gift is in the speaking, the act of communicating. We don't really understand the gift. It cannot truly be the gift God gave us if we don't give it, if we don't honor it by using it. If you look at the list of spiritual gifts in today's passage, almost all of them involve an action, doing something: healing, working miracles, prophecy, discernment of spirits, speaking in tongues, interpretation of tongues. The only one that doesn't, on the surface, seem to be an action is, he talks about the gift of faith. And I think, well, it's clear to me that he means that faith is active, has to be active, or it's not really faith. And how are we to use our gifts? Paul writes, to each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good, for each other. When Edwin put on that hat and kept it on, he was expressing thankfulness, which is certainly a spiritual gift. And because he understood that gift and used it to give that thankfulness back to Bob, everybody around them was warned. Wasn't big and dramatic, no tongues of fire, but I've never forgotten it. And I would bet neither has anybody else who was on that hike. On this day of Pentecost, let us remember that God gives us spiritual gifts to use for the common good. That's what they're for. And that's how we, in little ways that can turn into big ways, can work miracles. Thanks be to God.